The first thing they heard was the drill breaking through, not the machinery. That sound was constant, the deep mechanical moan that Harrow's Gate ran on, the pulse of tungsten-tipped rotors chewing through the asteroid's iron crust. No, this was something else. Something underneath. A frequency that the sensors logged as ambient, and Maren Voss felt in her sternum through the vibration of the floor, like a cord struck on a string too long to see. She noticed it because she noticed everything that way. Sound had been denied to her for 11 years, since the pressure seal on Reactor 4 blew inward, and the shockwave took most of the hair cells in both cochleae and all of the hearing in one clean, irreversible instant. She was 22 then. A junior systems engineer who made the mistake of standing in the wrong corridor at the wrong moment. She was 33 now, and she had learned to listen with her whole body, fingertips on metal panels, feet flat on the decking. The subtle calibration of a neural interface that converted surrounding vibration into a three-dimensional pressure map her visual cortex had learned, slowly and with great difficulty, to read like a second sight. She could feel the station breathe. She could feel the difference between a person walking fast and a person walking afraid. So when the tone shifted, deep in Harrow's Gate's bones, in the substrate beneath the substrate, she felt it. She almost said something out loud. She stopped herself, which was habit, touched the subvocalizer at her throat, and pinged her father. Dad, Sector 9 drill readings. Look at the secondary harmonics. His reply came back through text on her interface lens. Already looking. Meet me at the ops center. Commander Dale Voss was a tall man who had gotten shorter over the years, the way men who carry too much responsibility eventually do, compressing downward under the weight of decisions. He was standing at the holographic feed when Maren arrived, his hands clasped at his back, his face lit by the pale blue of 300 feeds from the drill site in Sector 9. The drill team had broken through into a cavity. This happened sometimes. The asteroid, designated 2041 Harrow, informally called the Rock, officially called the site of humanity's most profitable rare earth extraction operation in the belt, was riddled with ancient voids, pockets left by gas expansion billions of years ago. Standard protocol was to seal them, reroute, continue. This cavity was different. The sensors in the drill head showed it extending in every direction farther than the instruments could reach. A vast interior space, lightless, ancient, kept sealed from the universe by kilometers of iron and silicate for a span of time that the geologists, when they were asked later, could not even estimate with confidence. They used words like geological epoch and pre-solar and then went quiet. The drill team sent in a probe. The probe lasted 9 minutes. Maren watched the feed with her father and 14 other senior staff, and none of them understood what they were seeing until the probe's external microphone, a passive instrument, never meant to transmit, meant only to record ambient acoustic data for geological analysis, began picking up the response. The cavity was full of something, and it had heard the probe. The footage was 37 seconds of a darkness that suddenly filled with moving shapes. Compact bodies, each the size of a medium dog, covered in something that was not quite skin and not quite shell, suspended on wings that beat in a frequency pattern outside standard visual resolution, so that they appeared, in the probe's light, almost motionless while moving very fast. No eyes, none anywhere. Where eyes should have been, smooth, seamless surfaces marked by shallow depressions that pulsed in precise rhythm. Sonar organs, 37 seconds. Then the probe went dark. In the silence that followed, Maren's interface picked up her father's heartbeat through the vibration of his boot soles on the deck. It was elevated. He was afraid. She had never in 33 years known her father to be afraid. Seal Sector 9, he subvocalized, then out loud to the room. Full lockdown. No machinery running in the adjacent corridors. I want zero vibration in a 200-meter radius of that breach. He paused. He looked at the dark screen where the probe feed had been. Zero. Nobody asked why. They had all seen the footage. They sealed Sector 9 in 11 minutes. It took the Keth, which was the name someone coined by the third day, pulled from a linguistic root meaning the hunger that arrives without warning, and which stuck because no one offered anything better. It took the Keth approximately 4 hours to find the hairline gap between the drill casing and the bore wall, and to pour through it in a stream that no one saw until the motion sensors in Corridor 9 Alpha went dark, one by one, in a cascade that moved at walking pace and then at running pace and then faster than anything walking or running could account for. They ate 3 people before anyone understood what was happening. They ate them in silence, which was the wrong word, because the Keth were not silent. They produced a constant subsonic pulse that Marin felt before she heard about the deaths. Felt it as a pressure in her jaw, and her temples, and the soft tissue behind her eyes. A wrongness. What she meant, when she tried to explain it later, was that the Keth ate without warning. No growl, no call, nothing that the ears of the surviving workers on the far end of Corridor 9 Alpha had any hope of interpreting as danger until the screaming started. And the screaming only made things worse. She understood that part before anyone else did. She pulled up the probe footage again, alone in her bunk, with the station on high alert and the distant muffled thuds of emergency bulkheads cycling, and she watched the 37 seconds on loop, watched the way the Keth had moved before the probe's first ping. They were there in the footage from the beginning, she realized, if you knew what to look for. Hanging in the dark, motionless, waiting maybe, or simply existing in the way that things in the deep and sealed dark simply existed, without urgency, without awareness of time. And then the sonar pulse from the probe hit the cavity walls, and they turned. Not all at once, in a wave. Like a single organism given a nerve signal. They were acoustic predators. They had evolved in a cavity with no light, no chemosensory gradient worth tracking, no thermal variation. Sound was the only thing that moved in there. Sound was everything. They had built every instinct, every reflex, every behavior around the detection and the hunting of sound. And when sound came, when the probe sang its single electronic chirp into their ancient dark, they had come to it the way a shark comes to blood. She sub-vocalized a note to her father at 3 a.m. They're not aggressive. They're hungry. Everything that makes noise is food to them. If we're quiet enough, his response took 4 minutes. I know, working on it. Try to sleep, she did not sleep. By morning, the Keth had spread through 2 sectors. The difficulty was that Harrow's Gate was a working industrial station. It was built on noise. 312 people lived inside it, and industrial stations breathed noise the way biological beings breathed air. The ventilation systems, the recyclers, the water processors, the 1,000 small mechanical acts that kept 312 people alive in the vacuum of the asteroid belt. You could silence a corridor. You could silence a sector. You could not silence a station, not while it was keeping people alive, and every system you shut down to reduce the acoustic signature was a system you needed to not die. Her father worked with the engineering teams through the day, trying to calculate the minimum operating threshold. How quiet could Harrow's Gate get and still sustain life? The answer came back worse than anyone wanted. There was a floor. They could not get below it without beginning to kill people slowly through cold or hypoxia or thirst. The Keth, meanwhile, were not working to any threshold. They were simply following sound. They moved through the station in drifting swarms, responsive and eerily precise, finding every vibration, every hum, every mechanical tremor. They moved through air ducts. They moved through maintenance shafts. They were not large, but they were fast, and they were... This was the part that kept Marin awake. Learning. She could see it in the sensor data. The swarms that had swept Sector 9 the first night had been indiscriminate, reactive, hitting everything that resonated. By the second day, the swarms in Sector 12 were more deliberate. They paused at doorways. They hovered at intersections. They were building a map. She brought this to her father. He listened with his hands flat on the briefing table, the way he listened to things he did not want to hear. How long? He asked. To map the whole station? She did the math in her head. At current expansion rate, 3 days. And when they've mapped it, she didn't answer. She didn't need to. He was quiet for a long time. Then, the antenna array on the outer hull. Can you access it from inside without triggering the maintenance bays? Why? Because I want to call for help, and I don't want to ring the dinner bell doing it. She thought about it. I can get to the secondary junction in sublevel 4 without going through any compromised zones. From there, I can hardwire a tight beam transmission to the relay buoy. 16-minute lag to the nearest inhabited station. Do it. She went alone because she moved better alone. 312 people